chat to introduce yourselves and share with each other. The format for the session is that we'll present some of our ideas and experience, and then we'll open up for some questions and discussion. So do note down your questions as we go. So by way of framing for the 4 sessions, I'm going to start just with a few key ideas that are important to us at Collaborate. I'll keep these brief, as many of you will have heard these before at previous sessions. So to start with, we're working with, next slide please, Emma. We're working with complex challenges and contexts where outcomes are created by the interaction of many different actors and factors. And the route from A to B isn't obvious. And just because X led to Y before, it doesn't mean it will again, as every individual and every situation is unique. And what that means, next slide please, Emma, is that we can't rely on what's worked before working again. We can't rely on following a sort of standardized approach or a template to our work when we're working in complexity. We have to take a test and learn approach. And that means seeing every intervention as an experiment to learn from. And that can be at a level of one-to-one interactions between a practitioner and a service user, right through to big interventions in a whole system. Next slide, please, Emma. So learning then for us, it's not just about gathering insight, it's about adaptation. It's an involved process. We haven't actually learned anything until we've applied our insights and changed something. And that means that learning should be continuous and iterative. It should be a cycle of observing, interpreting, and intervening, and then making changes as a result of what we're learning. Next slide, please, Emma. So just to remind you that this is the third of our test and learn series. We started by thinking about how to create coherence from complexity using frameworks or models and learning questions and hypotheses to start to help us make sense of complexity. And then we went on to think about the kind of learning infrastructure that helps us structure learning, the processes, but also how to build the cultures and the capabilities for learning within our organizations and systems. And today we're really thinking about data. So what is the right data for learning? How do we gather it? And who decides what we gather? Next slide, please, Emma. So why gather data? Sounds like a stupid question, really. And I guess the question is not so much why gather it, but what are we gathering it for? And we're thinking here about the data that helps us learn and make change. And we recognize that there are other purposes for gathering data besides learning. So for accountability, for monitoring, for measuring, if that's the thing that we can do, measuring and in some cases proving or providing evidence for impact. But here we're really thinking about the data that helps us learn about what's working and how to improve on that, and how to do things better next time, or in our current work. So I'm going to hand you over now to my colleague Lee, who's going to really delve into what that means.
Good morning. Okay, so as we've said in previous sessions, as we've kind of started to point to already, we see learning as an ongoing and active process and moving from information to generating insight and then applying that insight to actually um, act on something to inform what we do and how we do it. So we need the data and or information to understand, to generate insights in the first place. So, not so much for accountability, but for the generation of insight for the sake of learning, as Naomi was already saying. So, next slide. What sorts of data help with learning? Short answer is it depends. So, we've um, put together a kind of matrix, these quadrants to illustrate that. Um, on one axis, we have qualitative data and quantitative data on kind of opposite ends. On another axis, we have more explicit observable data and more felt or experiential data on either end. And if you click through, Emma, we've kind of plotted some examples. So it is possible to use quantitative data, I think, for learning. I think probably many of us on this call will associate data for learning with more qualitative data. For example, on the kind of bottom left quadrant of our visual, where we've plotted personal reflections, right? Like very experienced, very qualitative data, but we can use quantitative data as well, both on more explicit observable data, like numbers of people participating, as well as more experiential data. For example, we might ask people how they feel on a scale of 1 to 10. Um, those measures in and of themselves are unlikely to tell us very much when we're working in complexity, but we can use them um, to generate insights that we then apply for learning. We can also look to more explicit kinds of qualitative data, um, more observable kinds of qualitative data. For example, like the quality of collaboration and learning that we can observe is happening in a group or on a program. So we can think about all of these and the applications for specific contexts. Next slide. But we want to manage a few tensions along the way. So these are some that we've been thinking about recently. Firstly, managing the tension between measuring and kind of reflecting. So measuring can feel quite straightforward. It can satisfy a desire to know and control. Um, but in fact, we don't control for outcomes because they're the product of lots of actors and factors interacting, as Naomi was saying, when we're working in complexity. So we do need to stop and reflect um, and use learning questions to guide in reflection for improvement and adaptation, recognizing that those different actors and factors are um, you know very busy all the time, and we things are changing all around us as we speak. So measuring isn't quite enough, and we also need to kind of there's an interaction between these. We can reflect on what we are measuring, and in fact, that's really important. So next slide. Second tension is unsurprisingly between qualitative and quantitative measures. So um, for funding, we often need to produce quantitative measures. They can feel more tangible, they can carry more weight or more legitimacy, but qualitative measures are important for understanding how things are working, and some of the most important changes can't be counted, can't be quantified. So important not to discount what we can't count. Um, and also in collecting qualitative data to think about the methods that we can use because the different approaches we take, whether we, gather qualitative information about, say, things like trust or comfort or understanding through a survey, will yield different results than if we were to have some focus groups, different results in terms of sample sizes, different results in terms of the quality and the kind of nature of that data. Next slide. Final tension is about result versus process. So we're understandably interested in outcomes, um, in how our work is generating impact. Um, and again, these are often in demand from funders, but we would suggest that process measures are essential enablers of results. So developing indicators of measurement and also learning questions about process, not just result, is something that we think is important. And these process measures can be kind of hard to reduce to indicators or to necessarily kind of put into a learning question, but we would say don't be discouraged. And especially as many of us are working on quite big problems, quite big kind of topics where outcomes may not be shifting substantially in short periods of time. Looking at process measures and celebrating progress on those can kind of provide some balance and help us understand where things are moving. They may well be moving in terms of process, things like democratic engagement, things like trust, which are really important enablers of results, as we've said. On the next slide, we're introducing one last thing. Um, oh, wait, not quite. So rounding this out kind of on a practical note, how to gather this kind of data for learning. So again, you might produce a model or framework to kind of hold everything. You might also want to build skills, culture, mechanics to support a learning culture. And then you might do a kind of data inventory to understand what you want to track, whether you already have it or it's already being kind of shared amongst partners and you can access it. Maybe develop data sharing agreements if partners are collecting data that you might be able to use for learning, kind of plan for how to collect or collate data. Potentially picking indicators or measures, and or developing learning questions, developing methods or kind of measures for holding that data. So logs or surveys or spreadsheets, Miro boards, templates, and finally, potentially creating dashboards and analysis tools if you are working with data that kind of makes sense to put into that format. And then for other kinds of data, like more reflective kind of textual data, scheduling opportunities to discuss and to also do sense making, which we're really going to come to on the next session, at the next one of these sessions. So come back for more on that. Now, the last thing, who decides what data is important? So we've talked about the kinds of data that can be used for learning, the things that you might do to gather that data, but who actually decides all of this? There are people who are in positions, in roles where it's expected that they decide what data is important to gather and how it is gathered, and therefore have power over the insights that are drawn from that information and the learning that is available. And then there are people who provide uh, data, who are sort of sources of data potentially, and who are involved or impacted by our programs, our offerings, the services we provide that the data speaks to, but who aren't in positions of making decisions about that data. So they're sort of their experience becomes data, or they are giving data, but they're not making decisions. One more click, Emma. What about people who are both? So on the next slide, we have a QR code, and alternatively, if you're on a computer, a link. So if you follow menti.com in a browser window, it will prompt you for that code on the screen, which is 67542512. We can also put that in the chat. You can either scan the QR code with a smartphone, and it'll take you to the Menti on your phone, or you can type that URL into a browser window and enter the code. What you'll find is a question about um, where you work, who decides what data is important. So in your current work, how many people are data givers and decision makers when it comes to determining what data you're gathering and how? So there might be a group of people who have experience of your services or your programs, who have a voice in what data you gather. Maybe you have a steering group that's specifically for this purpose. Or maybe there's someone who sits on your board who has experience of um, the things that you do, and who maybe have given or are giving you data and are shaping the decision making. Or maybe you haven't figured out how to involve people who are giving data in decision making. So where are you
Emma, I think
falling?
we're on the wrong slide on the Menti. Yeah.
Okay, it's going to prompt you. We skipped ahead. It's going to prompt you to do it a second, do the first one rather. But for those who did the second one, you're ahead. You might need to refresh your page either on your phone or on your computer. Great. We've got a couple votes in. And the reason we're asking this is because learning and evaluation activities can, privilege certain types of knowledge, certain ways of generating knowledge, and can sometimes measure conformity more than diversity, or reinforce isms like ableism or classism or racism, unless we take care to kind of mitigate against that. You know, we don't want to leave experiences out, or kind of ways of understanding the world out. Cool. So actually, folks on this call are coming from organizations that have a bit of a mix in terms of people who are both data givers and decision makers. Really curious if folks want to pop in the chat or just quickly chime in with an example of how that works. So is it the case that someone is on your board, as was the example I gave, or is it some other means?
Whilst we're waiting for folks to share in the chat, let's maybe move on to the examples, just with an eye to time.
Yeah, sounds good. Please do put that in the chat, though, if you are open to sharing. It's definitely of interest. So the next thing we're going to do is Emma's going to share the slides again, and we're going to go through a few examples of work that we have done or are doing at Collaborate that kind of point to those things that I just covered. Why gather data, who decides what data to gather, and the different ways that you might gather data for learning.
Great. Thanks, Lee. And sorry, I realize there's a lot of sun on my face, but I grew up in Scandinavia and I refuse to not have sun on my face when it's here. So the first example we're going to share is some work that we're doing with the team that deliver the Grenfell support program. So we act as independent scrutiny function to the Grenfell support program, which means we have a role in assessing whether the program is being delivered transparently and effectively in the interests of bereaved survivors and immediate community members, so the people that still live around the tower. We scrutinise the program delivery and monitoring through a framework, which asks the team that deliver the program, so the Grenfell Partnerships team, to provide monitoring data on a variety of things, including like information on delivery, information on reach, information on impact of the program, as well as on complaints and expenditure. So there's kind of like quantifiable metrics, but there's also qualitative data that comes from delivery team insights and kind of reflections from the different people involved in delivery about what is and is not working well. And the scrutiny framework was developed based on principles identified through conversations with bereaved survivors and immediate community members. So this is an example of getting in touch with the why of data gathering. So we really developed the scrutiny framework to help the team that delivers the Grenfell support program to focus on collecting data and making sense of data that actually helps them understand whether it's being delivered transparently and effectively in the interests of people that are eligible for the program. So to give you an example to make this more practical, there's a section in the scrutiny framework on reach. And it doesn't just ask about, how many people are eligible to access the program are accessing it. It asks the Grenfell Partnerships team to draw conclusions on what they can understand from the data that they have on reach. So, you can't answer that question by just providing a number on or a percentage of people accessing. You have to think about you know, um, what are the groups of people who aren't accessing the program? Is there a pattern in people who aren't accessing the program? Is it that there were lots of people accessing the program 6 months ago that are no longer accessing it, or is it that more people are accessing it than 6 months ago? Um, what have you heard from why people are accessing the program? It's, that question in the scrutiny framework is asking the team to dig into what that the number that they might have on reach is really telling them. And so in that way, we hope that the framework is supporting them to not only, think about different kinds of data that they'd want to collect, but also using that data to understand what the numbers mean. Um, And so I think, we're right at the beginning of kind of testing the scrutiny framework, but I think so far we found that that's been quite helpful in kind of broadening the scope of what data the team might collect. And again, getting in touch with that. Why are we collecting this data? And is it helping us understand more about what is and is not working well? So I'm going to move on to our next example, which I think Lee is going to cover.
Yeah, we can offer some more information in addition to what Naomi put in the chat in regards to the program, the support program. Yeah, I'm going to talk through Making It Happen, which was a program that we were the learning and evaluation partner for up to the summer. It was commissioned by East Sussex County Council's Public Health Department to reduce health inequalities and bolster people's capacity to lead healthy lives and be well. And it was motivated by an asset-based community development approach. So the idea was take asset-based approaches, people, kind of determine for themselves, for their own communities, what they need and make it happen, and that will reduce inequalities and kind of increase well-being. So 15 community development workers were on working on the project at 5 local organizations to get alongside people and help them start and grow all different kinds of groups and projects and host events. So they acted as kind of trusted advisors and navigators, connectors, and advocates to those people who were making things happen in their neighborhoods. And these were neighborhoods that were chosen because of their kind of placement on a position on kind of indices of high deprivation. Um, so we, as part of our evaluation, were exploring if, how, and why making it happen was working and for whom in the areas where it was delivered. So we co-developed an analytical framework, which again, we've talked about in a previous session. This framework was called Four Shifts, and it plotted like four shifts at different levels or scales that were of interest, not only to the county council, but also to community development workers themselves. So we kind of co-designed this framework. And then community development workers asked that we kind of focus on adapting already established processes because we took over administering the evaluation from another provider. And yeah, kind of making it more accessible. So we reviewed processes for collecting data and suggested adaptations on a rolling and flexible basis. So we didn't do that all at once. Um, and we adapted the methods to gather data from participants of projects and groups, as well as the kind of people who were leading on those and community development workers themselves, making the most of what was already in place, what was already happening, where and when people were already gathering. So practically, that looked like notes from workshops, survey data, um, mostly qualitative, collected stories and spreadsheets, and um, it wasn't all smooth sailing. So, for example, when we realized that the survey that we were gearing toward people who had been participating in groups, not in like a leading capacity, but really kind of just showing up, um, wasn't working well enough to involve their voices. And so we set out to host workshops instead, but again, like the transportation infrastructure, particularly in more rural areas of East Sussex, couldn't really support people to get across the county. And also, there was a matter of trust. So, folks had more trust in the people who were kind of leading those groups or those projects that they were involved in, more so than us, who aren't around as much. So, we again adapted and developed a template workshop plan and set of questions that the folks leading those groups or the community development workers who they had relationships with could use, like when and how they saw fit, which worked much better. So, just to say, it can be an iterative process. Like you don't necessarily have to set out to gather data and never change your approach. Sometimes you need to change your approach to get what works. So I'm going to pause there. I've just dropped a link to a a piece of writing about that project if anyone's interested.
Great. Thanks, Lee. So I'm going to share our third example, which was a project we did with a partnership called Dish. We joined their partnership as learning partner, and their goal was to test digital health monitoring devices with residents in Hounslow. We led 3 learning cycles to support the partnership to work better together. Each learning cycle included like a kickoff, a download conversation, a playback, and a final workshop. And so the data really came through the downloads, which were 30-minute conversations with each partnership member, creating space for them to reflect on the learning cycle topic and to raise themes that they were noticing. And then the themes from these conversations were like the things that we worked on in the workshops to support them to improve how they work together and what could be, I guess, yeah, what they might want to do with those themes, like how they might want to bring them forward. So I think what's important here is that obviously when we joined the partnership, they asked us to kind of come as learning partner to like the ways of working. We didn't know we didn't know anything about the dynamics of the group. We didn't know what whether they felt they were working well together, whether they felt that there were things that to improve, that a lot of it was very unknown. And so there weren't kind of specific questions that we knew we had to ask or specific um, conditions that we thought needed to be present that weren't present. So there was a lot of unknown for us as learning partner. And so we decided that the best way to kind of gather the data that we need to understand how they were working together and what was working well and not well was through these download conversations, to simply have open conversations with them and just say, you know, how is it for you? How are you working? What are the dynamics of the group? Like, what's present for you? And so we just had these really open conversations with them in each learning cycle. And, the kind of insight that came out of those conversations, the things that were like brought to the surface about how they were working and was we wouldn't have been able to, I don't think we would have been able to get so easily if we'd have gone in and asked specific questions about how they were working based on like our assumptions of how partnerships should work. And so this is like, we think this is an example of gathering the right data because we went, all we did was essentially set up half-an-hour conversations, but by having that kind of open space and asking them what was present for them, what they thought we needed to like have a discussion about, we got all the data that we needed about how they were working and what the dynamics of the group were. So, you know, all of this was kind of like became shared knowledge of the group once we like presented it. But before then, it was just kind of things that people were feeling about the dynamics of the group. But by like bringing that to the surface and then presenting it back to the group, it became this kind of data that we could work with to get them working better together. So yeah, that's a little bit of a different example, but we felt like it was important to kind of share as an example of gathering the right data. That was the data that the group needed to start working better together. So that brings me on to this next slide, which is kind of coming back to the kind of model that Lee explained at the beginning. And to help you kind of think about this more practically, we've plotted all of the examples that we've spoken about on this framework. And so you can see that the kind of Grenfell reach metrics that I was speaking about, the kind of quantifiable, like how many people are accessing the program, is it more people accessing the program now than 6 months ago? Those are the kind of explicit, observable data that is quantifiable, that's helped us understand the reach of the program. Then you have the making it happen example, so the stakeholder and community surveys that Lee led us through, which is still kind of the quantifiable or data, but is more felt and experiential data. So it came from the people running the program. And then you have the dish example in the kind of qualitative data, felt experiential quadrant, which came from just having open conversations. So the things that, we weren't able to, there's no set number or set thing that we could rate to kind of, that would be that data. It all came from conversations. So I hope you can see a bit more how we've kind of used this diagram to help us understand the data that came out of the different examples we've shared.
Just to clarify that both the Grenfell metrics and the making it happen data, survey data, had a combination
Mm.
of qualitative and quantitative data, which is why they're both in the middle, which you described earlier when you said, yes, there were these quantitative metrics in the scrutiny kind of documentation, but the kind of follow-up questions went beyond,
Yeah.
took them beyond those numbers into kind of generating more insight surrounding the numbers. And the same was true of the survey data. Whatever we did collect that was more quantitative was contextualized and kind of supplemented with qualitative. So they kind of fell more in the middle, whereas the dish approach was very much more qualitative.
Yeah. Thanks, Lee. So we're now gonna go back to the Mentimeter and back to the slide that we um some of you have already filled out, but I'll refresh it so we can come back to it. So I think the code, the link and the number will still be in the chat, and I'll bring that slide up. And maybe the rest of you that didn't manage to get to that slide can now fill it out.
Off the chart.
How interesting. There's a definite bias in this room towards one quadrant. Anybody want to give us an example of the kind of data that you're gathering that fits into that quantitative felt data? I'm guessing there's a lot of sort of user experience surveys, but that's just my guess. So if anyone wants to share, go ahead.
Sorry, I can't put my hand up, but I was going to say, like things like the Edinburgh Warwick measure, like ones where I guess there's more of a quantitative measure of like changes in well-being. Those sort of measures, we feel that they can be quite sort of favoured by sort of some of the other sort of bodies or organisations that we work with. Because of, I guess, it provides quite a neat and tidy indicator. So sometimes when we're looking at that more felt data, we can go towards that direction.
Mm. And do you feel like that is the right kind of data for you, for a learning purpose? I'm not wasn't
Yeah.
quite sure in the way that you sort of said
No,
that.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure myself. I think because having had conversations with organisations who we're working with, I think that there's something around whether the measure itself is, there's always something quite it's like, because that's an assessment that's done with people who are like receiving a service or support, and how do they feel about being like measured in that way and having to
Mm.
sort of disclose all of that. There's something there, and there's also something about, if we do have those measures on their own, what is that telling us? And also there's so many, before we go into the depth of qualitative insights, there's so many different ways that you can interpret those specific measures, that the person completing um the the questionnaire, us who are interpreting it without anything else, it's hard to kind of understand anything except whether there's been a change, but understanding why that's happened is really difficult.
Mm. Yeah, this is such a great example. Do you want to take the slide down, Emma? As we're moving into conversation. Anyone, yeah, want to jump in on Jenny's point or your own experience? And also, if you have got any questions from kind of what we've shared so far, if you've got things that you want to, yeah, you want to hear kind of a bit more about, feel free to pop your hand up.
I wonder if it's just helpful for me to add to Jenny's point because I think it relates to what we found on scrutinizing the Grenfell support program is that, like completely agree, Jenny, we're not, the all of the kind of quantitative data we're collecting on reach is really important. It is important to know how many people are accessing the program and whether they're accessing it more now instead of 6 months ago. But it's about considering what other types of data you need to collect, whether like quantitative or qualitative, that you'll need to understand that surface level data. And I think that's why the scrutiny framework has helped so much because, we're not offering it as something to punish the delivery team with it, like at all. It's about starting a conversation around, okay, we have this number. Can we actually draw any conclusions from it, or do we need to know more? What else do we need to know to be able to confidently draw a conclusion from the data that we have in front of us to make good changes to the program around reach? How can we reach more people? So yeah, it is about the kind of what more can we do to be more confident in the conclusions that we're drawing.
I really love that what you just said, Emma, because I think it really points to the shift that is involved in thinking about, data for learning rather than data for kind of proving or punishing or uh, you know counting and accounting for what we're doing. It, the shift is both kind of, are we collecting the right kinds of data, and what is it helpful for? Is it actually helping us to learn more about what we're doing? So it's definitely a more complex shift than we might at first kind of think. Yeah. Alexander, do you want to jump in?
Hey, I'm interested in reflections on what kind of data frameworks are appropriate for a portfolio of projects. You've talked a lot about, I think, kind of program or initiative level evaluation. But one thing that I struggle with in my role is my focus is on thinking about, okay, if we have like 2025 initiatives that are working in a similar area, but they each have their own kind of monitoring frameworks that yield very diverse kind of data approaches given the kind of respective context in which they're working. What approaches, I suppose, for learning are appropriate to deal with like heterogeneous kind of data types that cannot be easily kind of aggregated.
I feel like that takes us back to our first session a bit on those kind of overarching learning frameworks and models. And some of the ones that we presented were for developed for programs, which were, yeah, kind of like a portfolio of different projects. I'm thinking about the Cornerstone Fund as being a good example, Lee, where we developed a learning framework for a portfolio of funded projects, all very different projects, but with a kind of overarching purpose of testing approaches to systems change and collaborations. But the actual content of those projects was very, very variable. So yeah, how do you have data which is kind of meaningful across all of those projects? And so the starting point for that was co-designing with those projects a framework which spoke to the conditions for success across those projects, which ended up being called a kind of foundations for systems change framework, and that became the framework which guided the learning across the program. And that was, Lee, do you want to speak maybe a little bit about how we use that in terms of gathering kind of data for peer learning?
Yeah, so we it became a kind of common language or vocabulary um, and we used it in workshops that brought various partnerships together. We also used it in the course of producing the final report as a kind of guide for, coding, categorizing, drawing patterns from the data that we had, which was really primarily notes from learning conversations with the different partnerships. So I would say that was an example in which the framework provides a kind of common language or vocabulary or lexicon. I think there is another way of approaching data gathering for a portfolio of projects or programs, which is more about like aggregate impact. So maybe they're all doing different things, but there's an interest in understanding the impact that they're all having together. And so in that way, in that example, we might be more interested in like maturity. So Emma, I'm thinking about NELP, the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership for Sport England funded work to reduce inequalities that are keeping people from being physically active, recognizing that that's a very complex thing and you can't just kind of plop some equipment in a park and expect that everyone in that local area is suddenly going to become physically active when actually they have caring responsibilities and health conditions and kind of multiple jobs and all sorts of things that might impact whether they can or want to or are able to use that equipment, right? So there is and maybe I think I actually have it open. I will drop a link in the chat to conditions that the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership is tracking and analyzing, which are necessary to tackle inequalities in physical activity. These conditions are applied across the national evaluation, so across all of the different places that Sport England is funding. And Emma can say a bit more about that. Emma's closer to the data.
Yeah, sorry. So I was just trying to find the link as well, but I guess you have that one, Lee. So yeah, essentially, so there's a bunch of place partnerships around England that are trying to tackle inequalities in people being like that prevent people from being physically active. And essentially this model that's been developed, there's, was it there's lots of research that's gone into like the conditions that are needed for people to become physically active by tackling inequalities. And so the kind of model suggests that there are these conditions, and all the different place partnerships have been focusing on becoming more mature in certain conditions that they feel like are more relevant to them. So that's not to say that it's bad that they're not working on all of them at the same time, but it's just that some conditions might be more or less mature in the place. And so the place partnerships try to focus on the conditions that feel most relevant or like most like a barrier to their place becoming more physically active. And as a partnership, we ask the places to reflect on how mature they think the conditions are in their place every year by providing examples of their work or different initiatives that are going on. And so every year we look in the whole at how the conditions are maturing in each of the places and the kind of work that's going towards making the conditions more mature. So it's not at all like a performance ranking or anything like that. It's more about understanding how the conditions mature and how mature conditions help people become more physically active. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Emma. I was going to go back to Alexander and just say, did any of that help? And kind of what have you been doing? What sort of data have you been kind of experimenting with, I guess?
It's a really useful reflection. I think this Sport England example is very close, I think, to how we are thinking about our own work in terms of enabling conditions. I think one of the one of the concerns I have or the worries that I have about the way that that a focus on enabling conditions can lead to is that often you're in a position in an evaluation where you're sort of winning the battle but losing the war, where you can prove or demonstrate kind of development of enabling conditions, but the actual North Star of what you're trying to achieve is getting worse. And there is a kind of a lot of I think untested hypotheses about how enabling conditions actually lead to the kind of transformation that is the kind of guiding or kind of overall aim of a program, but which you could recognize obviously that is a product of a kind of really complicated set of actors, interventions that are way beyond your control. And so focusing, I think I worry a bit that if you focus on the things that are within your sphere of like either control or direct interest in terms of enabling conditions, and leave untested some of your hypotheses about how that may lead to longer term or more transformative change, you end up not building kind of field level knowledge about what is actually required in order to kind of reach a tipping point with any given change. But yeah, it's useful to know that I'm not the only one worrying about that.
No.
It's also worth noting that in this case, each of the partnerships places is also developing a theory of change, not like a really kind of logical, like as in
model.
yeah, logic model, logical kind of A to B theory of change, but they are thinking about their assumptions and how to test them through the activities that they think will yield the outcomes that they want. So there's a bit of that in here, but I think there's still something really important in what you're saying about how to kind of come at it from the North Star side.
Yeah, I
As
was
well.
just gonna add, I think that's what's you like definitely have a look at the Sport England NELP stuff because they started with 12 places over 4 years, like tracking the enabling conditions. And then Sport England have decided to roll it out to 80 places. So because they've been doing it for so long, Sport England have been keeping track, let's say, of that North Star. So yeah, I think you might find that really helpful.
If only we had longer to dig into this, but I think some really great questions and things that you have been grappling with. I guess our kind of final message before we leave is that it's really important to have the right mix of data. I think it was so interesting to see where the data just in this room was kind of concentrated in one quadrant. But it's rare, I would say, that you would get all of the insight that you needed from one kind of type of data. So thinking about kind of a spread of data across both, qualitative and quantitative and kind of observable, tangible, concrete, and the more kind of felt and experiential data is probably really important. And also that we shouldn't think that learning can't happen with that kind of tangible, concrete data, but it's about really looking at what can we understand from that data, what's the narrative behind the data, what is it telling us, not making assumptions that, oh, okay, we can see that we're going in the right direction or the wrong direction, and therefore we're doing something wrong or we're doing something right, but really starting to interrogate that data. And that's where we'll be going for our final session is making judgments, getting insights, and using those insights to improve what we're doing. So do come back for that conversation on the 27th of November. Could you pop up the slide with the QR code, Emma? And also, do reach out to us if you would like a follow-up conversation with our learning team. We are offering a 60-minute conversation to talk through learning issues that you're grappling with, and kind of share our experience in a bit more depth. If you're interested in that, then do reach out to Emma to book that in. If you're not already on Collaborate's mailing list, which I imagine most of you are, then please do use the QR code to sign up, so that we can stay in touch with you. And thanks again for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your days, everyone. And thank you to my colleagues Lee and Emma for sharing their experience and insights today as well.